Welcome to the third lecture on the Chinese philosopher of Xunzi. We have in the past talked about Xunzi's views of heaven and of ritual, and we have had an overview on Xunzi's general philosophy. We have also now pointed in the direction of where we want to go now with this third and final lecture on Xunzi, which is on the famous assertion that human nature is bad. This third lecture is on Xunzi's view of human nature. There is an accompanying handout that is available to you on Learning Suite that is the outline of this lecture. I will be looking here at this little computer to go over the outline and to guide the lecture. So to begin with, Xunzi famously asserts that human nature is bad, and he does this in chapter 23 of the Xunzi. And this, I think, is important to his philosophy, but I think that it has an unfortunate result. And the problem that I see is that Xunzi's assertion that human nature is bad in chapter 23, with his specific targeting of Mengzi, and there can be no mistake, he calls Mengzi out by name on several different occasions, and we'll see that as we go forward with this lecture. This has relegated Xunzi's philosophy in China to the second tier of importance. And I think that that is unfortunate because Xunzi is a much better philosopher than that second tier status. I think that Xunzi is being revitalized today in Chinese philosophy. Much too late, of course. But he is going to be really relegated to this secondary level. And when we discuss Neo-Confucianism, we'll see that Xunzi pretty much drops out of the picture. That Confucianism will essentially be the Confucianism that we get from Mengzi. So, in beginning to think about the idea that human nature is bad, Xunzi's articulation of human nature is very often, very frequently compared to the position of Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, and in his other work, De Cuive. And I think that there are important similarities. Remember that we've already said something about Hobbes when we were talking about Mozi. That Mozi, too, has certain overtones that are similar to those of the great English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. I suppose that we're going to have to say that Xunzi's position comes closer to that of Hobbes than that of Mozi. But maybe I'm mistaken about that. Maybe Xunzi simply is picking up the image of a kind of state of nature origin from Mozi and using it to his own purposes. But there are some things then that we ought to say about Hobbes. And again, there is this handout on the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes available on Learning Suite. Hobbes introduces a concept called the state of nature. And it is a heuristic device, a theoretical device that is intended to give us a picture of what human nature is in its raw form. In the state of nature, there is no government, there is no society in Hobbes's version. Society is really formed at the moment that we form ideas about government. In the state of nature, where there is no government, there is no society, Hobbes's view is that there is a state of war, of each against all. Every single individual is at war with every other single individual. And Hobbes develops this idea from certain claims about what human nature is like. First of all, we're rational. We are able to take the ends that we are seeking after, and we are able to rationally develop means for achieving those ends. So if I want your stuff, I can think of a very clever plan for thunking you on the head with a club and taking your stuff. Besides being rational, we're also egoistic. We have lots and lots of desires. I want your stuff, for instance. I have a strong desire for your stuff, and I am also rational enough to get that. The third assumption that Hobbes makes is one of relative equality. Human beings are all relatively equal. And there is a fourth condition that is going to lead to this state of nature war of each against all condition, and that is that there's scarcity of resources. While I have lots and lots of desires, unfortunately, the environment is unable to accommodate all of my desires. There is not enough to go around. And that, as we will see, is also going to be a problem for Xunzi. So, given these conditions, Hobbes thinks that we end up in a war of each against all, and that is an unhappy condition. Nobody is satisfied with the fearful condition of the state of nature. The problem is one of how do we get out of the state of nature? And for Hobbes, that problem is solved by a social contract. We come together and we decide that we are going to offer up some of our freedom, a good deal of our freedom, for security and protection. And it is rational for us to do this, says Hobbes, so long as everybody else that is in the state of nature with us agrees to the same conditions at the same time. Simultaneously, we all give up our freedom and we receive security in exchange. This is one of the very first episodes in which we see this classic playoff between freedom and security. Hobbes thinks that we should rationally opt for much greater security at the expense of our freedom, because the freedom is not valuable to us. It only makes things worse than they would be without it. Now, Xunzi has a similar assessment of early human development. So we get a couple of different versions of this. We read one version of it in chapter 19 in the Discourse on Ritual. And I think it opens in our book with this passage. He says, I say humans are born having desires. When they have desires but do not get the objects of those desires, then they cannot but seek some other means of satisfaction. If there is no limit to their seeking, then they cannot help but struggle with each other. If they struggle with each other, then there will be chaos. And if there is chaos, then they will be impoverished. And I think that you can see that Xunzi really is rather close to Hobbes here, that he does have an identification of those features that are going to lead to something like the war of each against all. This passage is seconded, so to speak, by another passage in the chapter entitled "That Human Nature is Bad." That's chapter 25, and this is so. The last quote is on page 274, and this quote is from page 298 in our CCP, and it goes like this: Now, people's nature is such that they are born with a fondness for profit. Both the first passage and the second passage have this egoistic aspect. We have desires for benefiting ourselves. So people's nature is such that they are born with a fondness for profit. If they follow along with this, then struggle and contention will arise, and yielding and deference will perish therein. They are born with feelings of hate and dislike. Here's something that's natural for human beings. We are born with aversions. We have hates and dislikes. These are natural for us, according to Xunzi. If they follow along with these, then cruelty and villainy will arise, and ritual and standards of righteousness, proper form and good order will perish therein. Thus, If people follow along with their inborn nature and dispositions, they are sure to come to struggle and contentions, turn to disrupting social divisions and disorder, and end up in violence. Again, I think that it's pretty clear that there is a powerful parallel between the conditions and situation that we have identified by Thomas Hobbes and those that we see in Xunzi. Now, Xunzi is not going to opt for a way out of this state of nature the way that Hobbes does. There is no such conception as a social contract that I think is going to come forward in this early period of classical Chinese philosophy. It is also important to remember, just going along with the outline that I prepared here, that these features of human nature, the ones that will lead us to chaos, are never eradicated fully from human nature. For Hobbes, they are always just under the surface, and so they are with Xunzi. Human nature will constantly need to be addressed to keep us from reverting back into this situation of chaos and violence. For Hobbes, what that means is that we have to have a very powerful government, a sovereign, who is going to constrain us at every turn so that we don't have the threat of having our human nature emerge and reassert itself, resulting in chaos and violence. As you might expect, the avenue for dealing with human nature for the Confucian Xunzi is ritual. The way by which we are going to attend to this badness of human nature is by ritual. But Xunzi has the same kind of difficulty that all state of nature theorists have. It's not just Hobbes. Hobbes has the problem of how we're going to get out of the state of nature. He thinks that we can do so with a social contract. It's important to realize, however, that not just any promise is going to do, because in the state of nature, there's nothing that is going to be in place for us to have an enforcement mechanism of our promises. Only a kind of simultaneous social contract, a covenant among ourselves all at the same time to give up our power is going to work. For social contract theorists like John Locke, we're going to have a different mechanism of getting out of the state of nature. In his version of the state of nature, there is not a great conflict between individuals. It is a condition of relative peace and harmony. Nevertheless, we have to get from there to government and political society. And Locke has the same kind of problem. How do we get from that state of nature to a state of political society? For Locke, the answer is that there are certain problems with rationality that must be addressed if we want to have a kind of rational discipline among ourselves. There is a law of nature for Locke, but the punishments that are allotted for violations of the law of nature is not uniform, and that's irrational for Locke. Part of the motivation then for forming a government is to have somebody who is not interested in particular cases, namely the government, be an arbiter in cases and to administer punishments that can be handed out uniformly rather than having each individual afflict a criminal with whatever punishment that person feels is appropriate. There is going to be some kind of uniformity. And for that reason, Locke thinks that we're going to enter into a social contract. And again, for Xunzi, we've got the same kind of problem. How do we get out of the state of nature into political society? And how do we do it without appealing to something like a social contract? And again, the answer for him is the rituals. But the problem is the people who invent the rituals. Remember that there's nothing in Xunzi like a revelation from a divine source of heaven. For him, heaven is indeed a metaphysical entity, but it's something like the totality of all things. And for him, we've got this really naturalistic picture. There is nothing in heaven that's going to tell these sage kings to put together these particular rituals by anything like a kind of revelation. So how is it that these sage kings, who Xunzi insists have the same degenerate human nature as all the rest of it, their human nature is bad as well, how is it that these people with bad natures are able to produce and create these human nature affecting rituals? And this is what Xunzi has to say about this. This is from RCCP 274. The former kings hated such chaos, that is, the chaos of this state of nature. They hated it. Remember that we are naturally born with likes and dislikes, hates and aversions. And one of the things that these guys hated, the sage kings, is all the chaos and disruption and lack of order in this state of nature condition. The former kings hated such chaos, and so they established rituals and the standards of righteousness in order to allot things to people to nurture their desires and satisfy their seeking. Notice what happens. The rituals are there to do certain things for us. They are to nurture our desires, give us new desires, make the other desires that we have be somewhat mitigated. They are going to attend to our desires. The rituals are also going to satisfy their seeking. Remember that we are extraordinarily desirous. Now this part is important because Xunzi really is attending to one of the central features that Hobbes has pointed out. So let's go on with the quotation from page 274. They cause desires never to exhaust material goods, and material goods never to be depleted by desires, so that the two support each other and prosper. This is how ritual arose. Notice that Xunzi is going right to the claim about scarcity of resources. How do we deal with scarcity of resources? This is a real problem in coming into political society, and it is a real problem in once you're in society. How do we deal with scarcity of resources? How do we distribute the things that we have in such a way that we are going to have order, but also, let's say, have equity? And this is one of the major concerns of political philosophy. We need to know how to make sure that everybody has a sufficient amount of stuff. And Xunzi suggests that ritual is going to be the pathway by which we are going to ameliorate our desires, so that our desires are not going to outstrip our resources. And then there is this additional passage, and this is from RCCP 285. The former kings hated such chaos, and therefore they established the sounds of Ya and Song in order to guide them. We're talking about music here. They caused the sounds to be enjoyable without becoming excessive. They caused the patterns to be recognizable without becoming degenerate. They caused the progression, complexity, intensity, and rhythm of the music to be sufficient to move the goodness in people's hearts. Now that's not natural. Remember, there's no natural goodness in people's hearts, but they can develop it through what we'll see Xunzi names as deliberate effort. So by deliberate effort, we can come to have goodness in our hearts, and music is going to speak to that goodness in our hearts. They caused perverse and corrupt chi to have no place to attach itself to them. This is the manner in which the former kings created music. And so why is Mozart denouncing it? And a further passage, this is from page RCCP, page 302. People's nature is bad. Thus, in ancient times, the sage kings saw that because their nature is bad, people were deviant, dangerous, and not correct in their behavior. And they were unruly, chaotic, and not well ordered. Therefore, for their sake, they set up the power of rulers and superiors in order to control them. They made clear ritual and standards of righteousness in order to transform them. This is the order of the sage kings and the transformation from ritual and standards of righteousness. This is from page 302. Notice that in the last step, what we have is the invention not of ritual, merely of ritual. I shouldn't say merely, but in addition to the invention of ritual and of music, we have here the invention by the sage kings of government. It is not imposed upon us. It is not something that we impose upon ourselves by some kind of a social contract. Rather, these guys, these sage kings, are going to come up with the idea in connection with ritual and music for, let's see how he puts it. They set up power of rulers and superior order in order to control them. This is the invention of government. So the sage kings, with the same wicked nature as all the rest of us, established music and ritual and government. And this leaves at least two issues to be investigated. One is this really the right understanding of human nature? Should we think that the Hobbesian picture, as we refer to it, this badness of human nature, is the right one? And of course, this is the basis of the dispute between Mengzi and Xunzi. And as I've said, in China, the decision has come down squarely on the side that Mengzi is the one who gets it right. The second issue is, if human nature is bad, how were these sage kings, who themselves have this wicked nature, how were they to circumnavigate their own natures? And I guess I don't have the answer to that second question on the handout. Let's see, though, if we can find it in the text. And this is in the chapter on ritual. Oh, sorry, it is in the chapter on human nature is bad. And this is on page 300 in our text. And it is halfway down the page. Someone asks, so notice that Xunzi follows the pattern that I've been asking you to do in your papers, and that is come up with an argument. He has an argument, and then also consider objections. So he is putting an objection in the mouth of someone. Someone asks, if people's nature is bad, then from what are ritual and the standards of righteousness produced? I answer, in every case, ritual and standards of righteousness are produced from the deliberate effort of the sage. They are not produced from people's nature. Thus, when the potter mixes clay and makes vessels, the vessels are produced from the deliberate efforts of the craftsman. They are not produced from people's nature. Thus, when the craftsman carves wood and makes utensils, the utensils are produced from the deliberate efforts of the craftsman. They are not produced from people's nature. The sage king accumulates reflections and deliberations and practices deliberate efforts and reason activities. And I think that probably, maybe I do have that passage here later in the handout, but we'll read through it again when we come to it. But before we get to what deliberate effort is all about, we need to talk a little bit about the diatribe that Xunzi puts up against Mengzi. On 4 occasions, he is going to call out Mengzi by name and his philosophy, or his claim that human nature is good. And Xunzi is going to take on several different aspects of that particular claim. The first of these takes place on page 299 of our CCP. And there, Xunzi says, Mengzi says, when people engage in learning, this manifests the goodness of their nature. In other words, goodness is going to be something that is going to come out through learning, or learning itself is a feature that shows that human nature is good. And this is the response that Xunzi gives to this particular version. This one is somewhat obscure. It seems to be, however, that what is natural is simple. And in becoming good, we have to cultivate these natural simplicities. These simples, however, cannot be developed. They are just taken as natural. Remember that he had previously referred to these sorts of things as the accomplishment of heaven. Human beings don't have to do anything about these. We don't have to think about them. We don't have to develop them. There they are. They are just these simples. And to think that they must be developed by learning is to make a mistake about the nature of the accomplishment of heaven. Here's the second of these points that Xunzi calls Mengzi out on. Mengzi says people's nature is good. This is on page 302. Here the idea is that if human nature is good, then it must be the case that people are fully moral at birth. And this is, I think, a reductio argument. He thinks that that's an absurd claim. Xunzi's response is that if this were the case, we would have no need for sage kings or ritual. Why do we need ritual? Why do we need the sage kings as moral exemplar if our nature is already good? We don't need these sort of things. It's from the legalistic commandment approach to thinking about moral development. We might think of it in terms of if human nature is good, why do we need the moral law to tell us what to do? Our nature is sufficient to guide us into the right kinds of actions. And the empiricist in Xunzi wants us to kind of experiment on this. And this one has to do with kind of using history, and you can do this if you live in the Warring States period. Remove government and see what happens if human nature is good, or if it reverts back to something like the Hobbesian state of nature. And Xunzi thinks that the answer is clear, that if we remove ritual and government and music, we're going to be left with this awful chaos. The next time in which he calls out Mengzi is on page 303, and this is what he says. Now, Mengzi says people's nature is good. Xunzi's response to this claim, this version of Mengzi and human nature being good, is that nothing conforms to Mengzi's distinctions, and that his idea about the goodness of human nature does not match the test of our experience. Well, what does that mean? The empirically and practical-minded Xunzi here believes that our philosophy cannot outstrip our experience in the world. And so, again, we have an experiment that says that human nature is going to devolve into chaos if we remove the things that are keeping it ordered: music and ritual and government. And we might put some language, we might impose some language on Xunzi that says that there is no kind of a priori way in which we're going to support the Mengzian claims that human nature is good. Experience is going to show us that, in fact, human nature is bad. And that brings us to the idea of deliberate effort that I took out of order from the handout. Sorry about that. So Xunzi says that the sage kings are able to develop ritual not by anything natural, but rather by deliberate effort. Now, we need to know what this business of deliberate effort is supposed to mean. And we may get a clue about the idea of deliberate effort at the bottom of page 301, where we find this quote: "Their nature does not know of ritual and the standards of righteousness, and so they must reflect and deliberate and seek to know them." When we think about deliberate, we probably ought to think about deliberate in conjunction with the adjectival form, in conjunction with this verb form, deliberate. Notice what he says here. They must reflect and deliberate. And then, in accord with their deliberations and reflections, they're going to take action. So he says, remember that we were born with likes and dislikes, and that the sage kings disliked the chaos. What it looks like, Xunzi believes, is that the sage kings engaged in mental, deliberate, reflective effort to try to figure out how to satisfy their, to ameliorate their dislike for the chaos. So here again, I think that Xunzi's picture of human nature is very much in accord with that of Hobbes. Remember that Hobbes is of the opinion that rationally we understand how to get what we want, and what we don't want is the chaos of the state of nature. And so rationally we think of a way out of it, and the way out of it is a big promise that we all make together that is going to save us from the chaos of the state of nature. In the same kind of way, we are going to rationally reflect and deliberate on what it would take to get us out of the state of nature, and then we're going to take actions on Xunzi's account that are going to be able to move us in the right kind of direction. It must be said that with respect to music and ritual, so sounds and ceremonial actions, that there has to be a good deal of deliberative, and we must even say creative effort, in which the sage kings are listening to tones and studying the actions of motions to see what sorts of motions are going to bring about a kind of mental condition that is going to make it so that human beings no longer live with each other in terms of violence and chaos, but are able now to ameliorate their desires so that our desires always accord with the resources that are available. That's how the sage kings are going to introduce ritual and music. How does deliberate effort make it so that we, as ordinary individuals, non-sages, non-gentlemen, are able to transform our natures? And here again, there has to be some kind of deliberate effort on individual parts. And this is what Xunzi has to say about that. And this is on page 261 of our CCP. This is the way individuals are going to go about using what's available to them. Now, we have ritual available to us, and we have teachers that are available to us. And so with those things already in place, now we're going to use deliberate effort in order to make ourselves good. This is how it goes. When you observe goodness in others, then inspect yourself, desirous of studying it. When you find badness in others, then examine yourself, fearful of discovering it. If you find goodness in your person, then approve of yourself. We have this notion that there is an aspect of human nature of approving and disapproving. Here we can transform our likes so that we now approve of goodness in ourselves. That is going to require, though, the imposition of some sort of ritual and music and government. When we discover, though, that this goodness lies within us, then we should approve. And when we discover something that is reprehensible in us, well, let's just keep reading. If you find goodness in your person, then approve of yourself. desirous of holding firm to it. If you find badness in your person, then reproach yourself, regarding it as a calamity. The way that deliberate effort is going to take place, remember that we deliberate and we reflect, and then we take actions. The actions that are in place are ritualistic actions. We listen to music, those sorts of things. We sponsor and support government, whatever actions there are. We have to take some certain actions, though, for our own lives, and these are resources that are available to us in becoming good. We have to deliberate and reflect, and we can do this by, in keeping with Xunzi's overall empirical picture, in which we are going to observe other people. And when we see other people, we are going to, and this is why I think Xunzi and Mengzi are, in some ways, not as far off as at least Xunzi wants us to believe. They both think that we are going to have an approving and disapproving mechanism that is going to lead us into morality. When we see other people, when you observe goodness in other people, we're going to see goodness in other people, and we're going to approve of that goodness in them. And then we are going to reflect and deliberate. We're going to look within ourselves. And when we see what's in ourselves in comparison with those others, then we're going to approve of our own selves as well. And when we look at people who are doing the wrong thing, we're going to disapprove of them, and then we're going to reflect and deliberate on our own selves, and by effort we're going to identify those features that we want to improve and those features that we want to eradicate from ourselves. And in this way, by deliberate effort, we are able to transform ourselves from having a bad nature into being a sage, a gentleman, or at least a decent person. And for Xunzi, this operation is very difficult. It's not difficult for Mengzi. And for that reason, Brian Van Norden is going to make the claim, and I think he's right about this, is that Xunzi comes actually closer to the original articulation of Confucianism that we get from Confucius than what we get in Mengzi. Remember that for Mengzi, transforming human nature is a matter of cultivation based on a kind of agricultural metaphor. We have these sprouts within us. They germinate naturally, and all we have to do is sort of sucker them, and we'll turn into a good person. You give them a little nutriment, and they're going to grow. That may be oversimplified of Mengzi. There may be more effort required, but it's not going to be on the order of what we get in Confucius. Remember that Confucius considers that the cultivation of a good character is really hard. It is, he says, like chiseling out and grinding and polishing jade. Remember this passage from the Analects. This is Analects 1:15. Zigong said, "Poor without being obsequious, rich without being arrogant. What would you say about someone like that?" The master answered, "That is acceptable, but it is still not as good as being poor yet joyful, rich and yet loving ritual." Zigong said, "An ode says, as if cut, as if polished, as if carved, as if ground. Is not this what you have in mind?" The master said, "Zigong, you are precisely the kind of person with whom one can begin to discuss the odes. Informed as to what has come before, you know what is to come." And what is it that Confucius has approved of in this reading of the odes from Zigong? And the idea is that we've got this really difficult task. We've got a rock, and it's not even really very lovely in its raw, natural form. It is green, but it is rough hewn, and it doesn't shine. and it's in the earth, and it may be covered with dirt. What we need to do is cut it out of the earth. Then we need to cut it into a shape. That is hard. We have to cut the stone, and then we've got to grind it. And it's not just that we have to grind it. Then we have to we have to carve it, and then we have to grind it. So we do a rough carving, and then we grind off the edges of it, and then we do a fine polishing of it, and finally we have a very beautiful product. But this is the product of considerable effort. Now compare that image to the image that we get from Xunzi. Xunzi says on page 299, thus, crooked wood must await steaming and straightening in the shaping frame, and only then does it become straight. The blunt metal must await honing and grinding, and only then does it become sharp. Now, since people's nature is bad, they must await teachers and proper models, and only then do they become correct in their behavior. So think about this image. We've got crooked wood, bent wood, or we've got bent wood and we want to, or we've got straight wood and we want to bend it. How do we do this? We've got to steam the wood, and then we put it on something that's called a shaping frame. Now you can think about that, but I mean, if you put a human being on one of these things, it would be like a torture device. We're going to put this wood on this frame, and then it's already been softened by something, and we are going to put considerable effort and weight and whatever it's going to take to bend this wood into the shape that we require. This is a hard process. Bending and shaping wood is difficult indeed. And so is taking a piece of metal and transforming it into, say, a knife blade. I think that's what he has in mind here, is some kind of a knife blade. We've got to pound it. We've got to get it thin. And then we're going to grind it. And it's still going to have roughness on the edge, so we're going to have to not just grind it, but we're going to have to polish it down so we've got a very, very fine edge in order for this metal to be useful to us. In the same way, human nature is of this type, and I think that this image is in keeping with that we get from Confucius, or the one that at least Confucius proves of. Human nature is recalcitrant. It is like wood. And it's very interesting that this wood metaphor is also used in Western literature. Isaiah Berlin has a very famous political philosophy book, or a book in moral philosophy called The Crooked Timber of Humanity. We have a bunch of people who are made out of crooked wood, and what we want to do is straighten that wood, and it is a real process of doing this. And for Xunzi and for Confucius, the way by which this is done, this serious effort is done through ritual. That is, we are going to have outward motions and sounds, ritual and music. And these outward motions and sounds are going to only be effective in shaping our character if, in fact, our internal states are in harmony with those actions and sounds. And when we deliberate on actions and sounds and reflect on our own goodness and badness, then we are able to sort out what we need to do in order to correct ourselves. And so that then is our final lecture on Xunzi. We will be moving on to Han Feizi next, and I will consider making a final or at least another video on the topic of Han Feizi. And so there we go. Thank you.